Hi everybody, and welcome to our 56th Creative Conversation, which is the third in our series focusing on creativity, assessment, and today's session, which is focusing on play-based learning, where we are welcoming our guests Ollie Bray and Suzanne Zedik and host David Cameron. So both Ollie and Suzanne have previously done a creative conversation, but not together, so it makes today's event extra special and doubly exciting. A few housekeeping things. The session is being recorded, and it would be great if you could turn off your microphones and cameras. If you could just double check they're off, it will really help to reduce background noise and also to save on bandwidth. So first of all, a massive thank you for joining us at this sellout event today, which has been offered as a part of the National Creative Learning Network annual event. And we really hope you've been able to join in with a few sessions this week. My name is Charlotte Bennett, and I am the Education Support Officer for Creative Learning for the South East Improvement Collaborative. My role is based within the Arts and Creative Learning team at the City of Edinburgh Council, and I lead on strategically developing creativity. I report to Linda Lees, who usually introduces these events, who's the Edinburgh City Lifelong Learning Strategic Manager, but my work extends across all the CEIC authorities. My post and these creative conversations are funded by the Creative Learning Network, so we are really grateful for the continued funding from Education Scotland in partnership with Creative Scotland. The Creative Learning Network also organised this week of professional learning, of which this conversation is part of. So before we start, you may have seen the link in the opening slide there, the final two events of the academic year in May and in June. And we would like to invite you to help us with our final celebration creative conversation in June, where we're going to be reflecting on numerous creative conversations and share examples of creative practice in what has been a very different and very challenging academic year. So if you or you know of someone who would be interested, please get in touch and I'll pop our contact details into the chat and you can drop us an email. But without further ado, let's get started and we'll welcome David, who's going to speak a little bit more about today's conversation and introduce our guests. So thanks, David. Over to you.
Thanks, Charlotte. And just from me, a massive welcome to you. You've been a real asset to the team already and a huge support for these conversations. So really hoping that people will take advantage of you being in post. We're really looking forward to that conversation that you spoke about, our celebration conversation at the end of the year, but we really want to focus on how all of this work that we've done and all of the things that we've talked about have manifested themselves in classrooms. So please, if there's anyone out there who thinks you've got anything that would be interesting to others, let us know, and we would be more than happy to talk about how you might become part of that conversation. It's more than time we respected teacher agency and got some other voices in the room. So all of that said, we've got two phenomenal voices in the room today. And the first of them is, well, not the first of them, because Suzanne's going to be the first speaker today, but we've got Ollie Bray with us today. When we first thought about this conversation, Ollie was working for Lego. And as far as I'm concerned, he appeared to do all the interesting and exciting things in Lego, apart from possibly make the bricks. He was responsible for technology, creativity, school improvement, yada, yada, yada. He did all of that stuff. I've known Ollie since he was a class teacher. He taught in East Lothian when I was there as head of education. And I just always loved the memory of visiting his school. He was young, he hadn't even started shaving. You'll see he's now forgotten how to, but he was young, but he was still brash and confident even at that stage. And the head teacher told me in the school I had to go and visit Mr. Bray's room, which was out in the huts. And when I went out in the foyer area in the hut, there was an electric fire. He cared nothing for health and safety. He'd got a coal effect fire in his foyer. It was completely decorated for Christmas and he had created Santa's grotto. And as I entered, the door of his classroom burst open and a bunch of young people leapt out and started singing Christmas carols to me. And I thought, this man's going to go somewhere but I didn't think it was going to be Education Scotland, because that's what's happened. Ollie's moved from Lego to Education Scotland as strategic director, and that's given a different feel to this conversation, because it's a chance to hear very early on from Ollie about some of his initial thoughts about possibilities and potential. And it's a real opportunity for him to put a stamp on the kind of conversations that he's going to be having. So we'll see a bit more when we lead on to Ollie's contribution this afternoon. To start us off, though, we've got Suzanne Zedik, who is one of my most valued colleagues, somebody that I've worked with a lot. We've done a whole host of different types of events together, from resilience right through to work on the divided brain, which has been a really exciting venture around the work of Ian McGilchrist, if anybody's interested in following up on that. Suzanne has become a hugely powerful voice in Scottish education around resilience, around trauma, around ACE awareness, but also around play. And I've heard her talk a number of times about that. What she'll do for us in this initial contribution is lift our eyes to look more widely around the whole concept of play, to take us into a range of issues around its long-term importance and the cultural issues that surround play in Scotland. And what she'll certainly do is get this creative conversation off yet again to another exciting and stimulating start. Suzanne.
Thank you, David. That's quite the introduction, and I was laughing as you made all of it because it sounds so grand, and I think that I just say obvious things, and sometimes I think, why do some of the things that I talk about seem to cause surprise? And that surprise helps me actually to think about the things that I think we don't think about. Okay. So there's lots of conversation going on about play in the country at the moment. And yet I think it is still surprising to us. I think we don't really get the importance and the value of play for human thriving, for children's development, for children's experience of the world. And that really intrigues me. Why has it been such a battle culturally to get us to think about play? And so I thought that I would kick off today just by helping us to think about that, because I do think that it's really notable that Education Scotland has appointed Ollie, with his background in play, to help guide policy and thinking. I think that's a really seminal moment. And I don't want us to miss the importance of it. And so I thought I would reflect on that by going back a bit in terms of our cultural insights. Okay. How does education in Scotland start? Well, state administered education starts in 1872. It might be a while since people have thought about that, but the Education Act of 1872 is what puts education in state hands. Okay, did we have education before then? Yes. The church oversaw education before it was in state hands. And I think that thinking about that history is really valuable, because I think it says something about why I think we're a bit suspicious about play. And I have tried to explore some of that in this new book by Upstart called Play is the Way. And I'm going to guess that Sue is here, Sue Palmer, who edited this book. And she's been trying to help to get this book into the hands of MSPs and as wide to many people in Scotland as possible. Okay, why do we need a book on play? And why was Upstart so keen to get it into the hands of MSPs? Just stopping to think about that is really interesting, because play is just a standard part of children's development, except I don't think we used to know that. And my real question is, do we know that now? So let me reflect on that just a little bit. We've got a lot of emphasis on outdoor play, on the importance of play, learning through play. I know we're doing a lot of talking about play, but if we really got it, we wouldn't need a book on it that tried to persuade political change so that we have more play embedded in policy and practice. So how come we need that? Okay, let me do a teeny bit of the science, and I think Ollie is going to come back to that science. Play is crucial to children's development. It shapes their biology. It shapes the way the neural pathways in their brain develop, the way that their stress system develops. Play has a biological impact on children's development. And we now know that play is important beyond the human species. It's important for mammals. So for anybody who doesn't know, there's a guy named Jaak Panksepp, who's a leading scientist on play. And he talks about the importance of play for mammals. And in fact, he now says that mammals' play is so important that the name of his academic position is this. He holds a position in Washington State University in the US, and the name of his position is the Bailey Endowed Chair of Animal Well-Being Science. Animal well-being. Well, he has helped the world to understand that animal well-being is based in the capacity of animals to play. That young mammals are shaped by the way they play in their environment, with their flock, with their tribe, with their families. What should we call each group of mammals? For human beings, that's a family or a school or a community. So if play is going to influence the development of brains and bodies, it's really important that we facilitate that. What we're really asking is, what do children need? And I'm not sure we always knew that children needed to play. And I'm not fully sure that we know it now. So I'm just trying to push us, given that this is a creative conversation, to ask, do we really get play? If we do, why does Sue Palmer want all the MSPs to have a book on children's play? So let me pull in one more theme before I wind up today. I think we're a bit suspicious of play. Maybe we think we get it now, but I just want to question whether we really do. Here's why I think we're not totally comfortable with it as a culture. In education, when we talk about play, but we use phrases like learning through play. Or if you see pictures of school in the newspaper, you still see pictures of desk or with books, so they look academic-y. And we've got the Play Talk Read bus. It's the Play Talk Read bus. It's not the Play bus or the Play Talk Laugh bus. It's the Play Talk Read bus. And I wish we were all in a room together, because I would hope that you're all kind of laughing at that observation. I think we are nervous about the idea of play on its own. I think we've been able to talk more about play and integrate that into policy and into classroom practice, because we now understand that children learn through play, and learning makes us feel safe. And I think we're proud of our academic history in Scotland, go all the way back to 1872 and to the church's overseeing of education before that. We've been proud of the fact that our children start school early at 5. And I think that's a cultural tradition we've been proud of, which gives Upstart a problem when they're saying, nah, we shouldn't start formal schooling at 4 or 5. We should be doing that at 7. And we should be having children have a whole lot wider forms of play until then. But I think play makes us nervous as a culture. So I got to thinking about, okay, where does that nervousness about play come from? And I'm perfectly happy if anybody here today disagrees. That will make an interesting part of the conversation. Actually, Suzanne, I'm not sure we are nervous about play anymore. I think we still are. And if we go all the way back to that religious history, if we think about that phrase, the devil finds work for idle hands to do, I think that we still think play is a bit frivolous. It's leisure. It's what you do after the serious work is done. And when you marry that kind of suspicious take on play with neoliberalism, which only values what you can put money to, I think we have a really interesting challenge on our hands. So I'm just trying to throw out some ideas that I think that one of the things that has stopped us from making as much progress as we could have made, and that makes Sue Palmer and Upstart's job harder, which is why I'm excited that Ollie is now so central to the thinking in Scotland. I think we are suspicious and made uneasy by play because it still seems frivolous. And if we can get past that, I think we can make great strides forward in Scotland. I think we can tie the push for play to children's rights, to the insights from the ACEs movement about trauma, which is really about children's development. And I think we can make great strides. But if we don't pay attention to some of the angst that that concept of play gives us, then we have real challenges on our hands. How's that for starter, David?
That's a good starter, Suzanne, and thank you very much for that. And I think one of the key things that's come out of that is lots and lots of links into other conversations about well-being, about trauma, about the long-term development of young people, lots of issues raised there about school start and so on. And I notice that Paul Mayer's got his hand up. Paul, do you want to come in at this stage? Paul? Okay, maybe later. We'll continue with the chat at this stage. What I think is really important about that is how fundamental the issue around the way we learn and the way we think about learning is. What Paul's doing is he pointed out in the chat how uncomfortable people are when we move away from the metrics, when we move away from those standard measures. You know, our priority is raising attainment, and that takes us into a really interesting area of how we judge what happens in our schools. And as you're pointing out, Suzanne, that sits at odds with the commitment to exploration, to building forward from the child. And Ollie will come back to this as well, but it takes us into this whole concept of catch, which I'm sure is something that we'll discuss as we move through the conversation. But thank you. And that's got us on to the right kind of perspective. I'm just a wee bit worried that we don't load too much on to poor Ollie Bray. Some people think his appointment was radical. Let's not make it a mistake. And I had a fascinating conversation this week with Jazam Polfar, who's doing a radio programme for Paul Dixie's new radio station, Teacher Hug, which is well worth checking out. And she does a programme called Everyday Heroes. And one of the things that I found myself saying in the conversation was that the key message of that programme is stop looking for heroes and find your own heroism. And, you know, I think we're not waiting for anyone, strategic directors or others, to come and rescue us. But we are hoping that they'll enable us. We are hoping that they'll permit us. And we are hoping that they'll encourage us to play. And given the grotto, the coal effect fire, the disregard for health and safety, I think the man to lead that is Ollie Bray, the only man in Scotland with a recent haircut, which I believe was done in the safety of his own home. So here he is, Ollie Bray, welcome.
Thanks, David. And yet the haircut was done completely legally and in the safety of my own home, and has become affectionately known as a TBH or a tennis ball head due to the size of the cut. I've got some slides that I'm going to that I'm going to share, and I'm hoping that somebody from the team in Edinburgh will share them, just so we've got something to talk through. That's great. Thanks for doing that. Now I'm not in control of my slides, so I'll be given a kind of a signal to move them on around that, and hopefully I'll remember what I wanted to say. But one of the kind of interesting remarks already. So first of all, I always enjoy listening to Suzanne. It's absolutely brilliant to kind of listen to that and to listen to your views. And I completely agree with everything that you've said. And hopefully I'll pick up on some of those themes and build on those themes from a really great start. But the other thing that I just wanted to sort of say from the outset of the conversation is that I'm sort of fairly new to this role. I think I'm sort of 7 weeks into this kind of new job. I'm getting to grips with the organisation, getting to grips with sort of living back in Scotland from Denmark, having been out of the scene for a couple of years. And if anybody on this call ever wants to kind of reach out for a chat or to engage on Twitter or to do whatever, if I can support with anything, I'm super happy to do that. And I know that David and Suzanne and other people that know me well on this call will sort of back that up. I'm not just saying that because I feel I should. If I can genuinely help, and if that is of any value, then please reach out and ask. So this picture that you can see in front of you this picture is actually from the International School of Billund, which is where Lego is based. And if we just move to the next slide, please. The interesting thing about the International School of Billund is that it's a fairly new school. It's been in existence for 7 years now, and it was completely built around the philosophy of learning through play or play pedagogies. And there's a couple of reasons that I'm mentioning this, or a few reasons really. One, it's a fascinating place to visit if you ever get a chance to visit it. Secondly, I think it really shows that I think it just really goes to show that you can create a play-based curriculum, bearing in mind that young people at the International School of Billund, they come to school from 3 all the way to 16, before they transition elsewhere into the Danish system or a different international school, is that you can have play at the heart of the curriculum linked into pedagogy all the way through. Because actually we've had our first young people now that have moved out of the school, that have been through the rest of the Danish system, that have gone on to get jobs, that have gone into to college placements, that have gone to universities, like with this kind of real sound grounding. And so I guess what I'm sort of saying is that it is possible here. The other interesting thing about this is that there was a strong learning agenda that was built into this school, from the start, from Harvard Graduate School of Education, actually, and the team from Project Zero, which is perhaps most famous for Howard Gardner's work on multiple intelligences, but do all kinds of other work as well around visible learning and, as I've mentioned already, the pedagogy of play. And I'll maybe stick some links up into the chat. But one of the reasons that I wanted to mention this is that I'm still currently chair of the board of International School of Billund, and when I left Lego and I came back to Scotland, I was asked whether I would want to sort of continue with that role on the board, and my initial reaction was, well, it's an awful lot of work, to be doing that, and it's a school that's several hundred miles away. But to be honest, I just actually couldn't say no, because it's just such a fascinating place to support and to visit, and I'll continue to visit when I get a chance. And I've just sort of learned so much from being in the school and working with the staff there and working with Project Zero there as well. And I guess one of the reasons I'm sort of mentioning that is that it's such an important thing in terms of me and who I am and wanting to be kind of connected to schools. And if we go to the next slide, please. The other things that I kind of wanted to mention, just I guess sort of in terms of credentials, and David did a good job of introducing me at the start, is just around some of other bits of work that I've been involved in before, which I think is sort of highly playful in nature. So most recently, obviously, sort of working with the Lego Foundation around digital technologies and play and school improvement linked to play, but also some of our Lego Foundation partners. I've mentioned Project Zero already, but but working, for example, with the fascinating people, at Sesame Workshop who are behind the Muppets, and using play in refugee and crisis settings as well. But previously, and perhaps almost historically now, had an interest in this agenda because of the use of digital and playful technologies in school, based around early work with the Consularium, which was a Learning and Teaching in Scotland project, and then work that I've been involved in for a long time now with the European SchoolNet Academy, where we've had over 10,000 teachers from across Europe that have gone through this online facilitated MOOC about the use of computer games in schools. And one of the interesting things about this, of course, is that it's not about the technology, it's about the pedagogy. It's about actually using these rich learning environments through the use of play, through the use of the outdoors, through the use of real environments to create interesting and engaging spaces for children to go. So just wanted to give a bit of background there around some experiences and some credentials, because I'm drawing on a lot of this, both if I take this into my new role, but also hopefully to provide a bit of validity behind what I want to say. And maybe start off then by moving to the next slide with a picture that I took just over a year ago now, when travel was still possible, and I was out doing some work with the Ministry of Education in New Zealand, and as just like any place that I go on holiday, which is a bit sad, but also for work, I like to go and visit schools, because I think we learn an awful lot from walking around schools and smelling schools and seeing what's on the wall and experiencing it. And New Zealand has got a very play-based curriculum, again, particularly in the early years and in early primary. And it was really kind of pleased to see this as I went into the classroom. But I was less pleased, for example, to kind of see a sign that was up there, like pointing out that this was play in progress. And I actually thought that they put that on there for me to look at. And I brought that up with the teacher who I struck up an instant relationship with, and they said, "Oh no, that's nothing to do with trying to point out that we're embracing the play-based curriculum here. This is to point out to the cleaner that actually play doesn't just finish at the end of the day, and children want to continue with their playful learning experiences into the next day, into the next day, into the next day. So we put this sign up to stop the cleaner cleaning up all of this mess, so that children can continue playing and learning via what was the potion table that they created there." And the reason that I'm saying this is that I think it's fairly well accepted now in Scotland and in other parts of the world, and increasingly in countries that have got less developed education systems, that play is an incredibly important part of early childhood and indeed early primary education. And if I move to a different end of the spectrum, so for example, if I can have the next slide, please. And if I look at, some of the arguably the most successful businesses in the world, these all seem to be businesses that have also embraced the playful agenda. So bottom left, you would expect me to mention this is Lego and the Lego house. You would expect that to have a playful working environment and a playful culture that's built around it, as well, because of what they make, which is they're in the toy business. But moving from the top left round, it's interesting that when you go into the Google offices in London, the word play is prominent on the wall as soon as you walk into the main office. That play and playfulness linked to iteration is such an important part of it. And again, if I go round the Microsoft offices in Seattle, they've got a tree house where you can have these meetings, again, these playful working environments, and down then to the bottom right hand corner where you've got, again, these playful learning environments in the Google offices in Zurich. Now, what's interesting about this is that some of these businesses are obviously incredibly successful around this. There's an argument to perhaps suggest that play is important in the early years, and increasingly people are starting to understand that play and learning through play and engaging with play is actually an important part, of building successful businesses as well. Now, you might, expect me to sort of say here, well, or you might come back with a challenge here saying, well, what you've mentioned here is a toy company that engages in play and technology companies that have got a lot of money and therefore they can invest, in these environments. But if we go to the next slide, please. I would also suggest that actually that you can be playful and engage in play in a whole variety of businesses, even businesses that we might not have imagined before. And I think this is a great example of playfulness here from Transport Scotland, who each year, run these competitions around, what would be a good name for a road gritter. And there's something about this and the humour behind this and the joy behind this, which kind of, would just suggest to me that this is a really interesting, place to work. My favourites here are, Grits and Pieces, Gritty Gritty Bang Bang, and Greta Thunberg. And if you're a bit bored with what I'm saying, why not put your own name for a road gritter into the chat, like over the next sort of few minutes, and we'll maybe pick the best one at the end. Now, one of the interesting things about all of these things is, again, you could probably come back with me to hear a bit of a challenge about saying, well, this is actually a little bit to do with the environment. Like, if we had a lot of money, we could turn the whole place, into a really playful environment, or we've got, and part of it is obviously also to do with permission, making this work as well. So the person that gave permission within Transport Scotland here may have perceived to have been sort of quite brave in terms of changing the culture, and in terms of doing that. But if we go to the next slide, and if we look at a different kind of playful environment here, here's a picture that I took in China a few years ago of a really, I think, playful outdoor classroom, which is obviously designed to have a purpose, which is teaching geography and kind of earth science. But what I would say is that it's completely soulless in nature around that. So it's not just about the environment. For me, it's 10 times deeper than that. And if we could just go to the next slide. And for me, this is stuff that we already know, but we can't forget it. It's partly about context, and part of context is obviously about the environment, but it's also about the culture that David was talking about in some of his opening remarks, and thinking a little bit about, how do we actually kind of create that culture for learning through play and playfulness to exist. And that culture, needs to exist all the way from a policy level, all the way down to, to classroom level as well. And what I want to do in the sort of the remaining part of some of these opening remarks is to stick out a few provocations, and also that might give us something that we can hang the rest of the conversation off. So if we just go to the next slide, the first thing that I want to say is I think there are some real paradoxes between learning through play and what school is. And these are just some classic examples here. So play generally, would be classed as, timeless, perhaps chaotic, risky, perhaps child-led. Where if we think about schools with some of these things here, then schools might normally be perhaps timetabled, perhaps orderly in nature, inherently safe places, and often adult-led. And I would say that these are some interesting paradoxes that we need to navigate across as teachers and as school leaders and people that really want to influence the playful agenda. But what's important here, I think, is not trying to make the case that it should be one or the other. It's about navigating, some of these paradoxes where appropriate for the context, and for the culture, of the school as well. So sometimes we want schools to be incredibly safe places if children are doing certain activities, but also we want to sometimes go to the left-hand side of the diagram to allow children to experiment with risk, because that's, of course, how they learn. And if we just move to the next slide, what I kind of want to do with this slide is kind of talk a little bit about where, how I think about play, and what I think are 5 characteristics of playful experiences. And I noticed that these characteristics were also referenced on one part of the Play Scotland website as well. So we think around, or our thinking within the Lego Foundation, based on a whole lot of research, is that to get a really good kind of playful experience, it tends to be based on these kind of 5 characteristics, which are not equal at all times, and they're not necessarily there at all times as well. But we would define a good learning through play experience as a learning through play experience that was, or as an experience that was actively engaging, for the child. They were engaged in their own learning. That was meaningful for the child, meaningful for them in particular. So it was coming from the child. That was iterative in nature, so building on an activity, or building on knowledge around that. That normally would be kind of socially interactive, although I acknowledge that you can play by yourself, but we think that the best forms of play are social in nature. In fact, play is an incredibly social thing. And actually the experience itself was joyful. And I'm purposely using the word joyful there and not fun, because I think there's a difference between the word fun and the word joyful. And just to give an example of that is that if I was to go out and to run a marathon, which would be pretty unlikely at the moment, I would probably hate every moment of it, and it definitely wouldn't be fun. But if I would get to the end of that, the endorphins would be running, I would be feeling very, very proud of myself, and I would be overwhelmed with that huge feeling of joy. And if you just sort of think about that at the moment, from a powerful learning experience that you've had, it's not necessarily fun, this kind of one-off tokenistic experience. It's that feeling of joy that when you've achieved something, which is important. And these factors are incredibly important in learning through play. And the interesting thing about these factors, I think, if we go to the next slide, is that, in terms of helping people understand, like learning through play, for me, it's about helping people that don't like the P word, the play word, to understand that actually, I think that these could be substituted for really good characteristics of a really good lesson, you know, or an excellent lesson or a very good lesson, or whatever terms that you want to use. Like, we want children to be actively engaged. We want the learning to be iterative in nature. Social interaction between peers or social interaction between the child and the teacher is really useful, you know, in a really good lesson. We want children coming out of that lesson enjoying it, so they're ready to go back. And of course, we want it to be meaningful for them, you know, and having the opportunity to explore things that are meaningful for them. And there's purpose, you know, behind some of these activities. And of course, I'm not just making this up. So if we just move to the next slide as well, is that these 5 characteristics, when they were developed, were actually developed by a number of researchers, and they all come from a lot of the learning in the book here, how people learn. And I mentioned the second title here, which the characteristics weren't based on, but the second title is, in my mind, is equally as important in the first. And the reason I wanted to flag it up is because I like the subtitle of the second book, How People Learn Too: Learners, Contexts and Cultures, and I've already kind of touched on that as well. So actually, these characteristics of learning through play, you know, are all based on learning science as well. So there's sound arguments, you know, for using them in classrooms. Now, one of the challenges, for example, that we had at the International School of Billund is, of course, that if you take these 5 characteristics, these 5 characteristics are actually 5 generic characteristics where you would maybe have in any learning through play experience, at home, in a school, you know, in a museum. And again, they need to be culturally situated. So if we move to the next slide, please, one of the things that we did at the International School of Billund to inform their planning around play is we took these characteristics and we introduced a research methodology that we paraphrased as let's hit the ground listening. So we went into classrooms, did classroom observations, we interviewed kids, we interviewed parents, we interviewed members of staff to actually try and get what we then called, you know, these 3 these 3 indicators for the situation of the International School of Billund of what playful learning might look like. And within these indicators of playful learning, which are specific to this school, you know, as a result of that, we concluded that within the International School of Billund, if that you had some choice and some wonder and some delight in that learning, then playful learning was likely to happen. And as we went through this, we developed the model from just being an observation model to this is what this looks like in the classroom, to actually how were the children feeling and how were the teachers feeling as well. So this is what it looks like and this is what it feels like. And we got a bit of traction with this, like in the International School of Billund, that teachers use this as a planning tool, or a version of this as a planning tool based around choice, wonder and delight. They also use it as an evaluation tool. But then we thought, well, what would be quite interesting, this piece of work, is what if we take it to a different cultural context? So we took this to some schools in South Africa, if you go to the next slide, please. And what was interesting here is, again, starting off with the 5 characteristics based on the learning science, but the model, the conceptual model that came out for this kind of South African model here, it looks kind of similar and feels kind of similar to the International School of Billund model, but it's quite different in terms of the words. You know, we've got the word ownership there rather than the word choice. Now, actually, if you look at the looks and feels like between the two, it's kind of saying the same things, but South African teachers preferred the word ownership, whereas teachers in the international school, you know, preferred the word choice. And again, the reason that I'm mentioning this is that if we're going to develop these kind of rich, playful experiences in schools, it's got to be fitted to your own context. We can't just take a model and try and retrofit it in. And then the last sort of few comments just to sort of make then, if we go to the next slide now, is that when I think about learning through play, again, I think to the research and I think about it on a spectrum, where at one end of the spectrum, we've got structure and we've got instruction. And the other end of the spectrum, we've got free play. Now, I think within a school, within any school, there's a place for instruction. Sometimes that's important. Sometimes there's an absolute place for free play, you know, completely exploring things. But I think the notion of what we might call guided play, you know, where the teacher is acting like a coach and is acting as a prompt, or we've got some peer learning going on there, that's quite often, you know, where we can make the best gains in terms of learning as well. So I think it's useful sometimes, if we're trying to get more play into our schools, to think about, when do we have playful instruction? When are we using games? When have we got examples of guided play? And when is free play appropriate? Because, of course, it is from time to time as well. And then if we just move to the next slide, the other thing that I'm very keen on is trying to link learning through play, or these characteristics of learning through play, to evidence-based practice. So we did a bit of work with the Australian Council for for Education and some of our own researchers at the Lego Foundation, and we looked through a whole list of kind of active pedagogies or a range of pedagogies, and we tried to link this range of pedagogies based in, again, pedagogical design to, again, these kind of 5 characteristics. And what we concluded is that the pedagogies that you can see there on the screen, collaborative learning, cooperative learning, experimental learning, guided discovery, inquiry-based, problem-based and project-based learning, are all highly playful in nature, if they're done, in the right way. And the reason that I mention this is that sometimes people say to me, well, why can't we get more? You could never get learning through play, aspects of learning through play into a secondary school. And actually, I think that you can. I think that a secondary school that is willing to do good cooperative or collaborative learning well, and we need to go back and revisit that, in a lot of schools, and a secondary school or a primary school that's willing to do project-based or problem-based learning really well and build up a framework around that, again linked into it, is highly playful in nature, and this will help young people develop a wide range of skills in that. And then if we just move to the next slide. Because again, for anybody that's sort of trying to get more learning through play into school, particularly for the older years group, I would always, encourage perhaps starting with collaborative learning, as I've mentioned already, or a project-based focus. It's thinking about how can we link that into the whole, creative learning spiral. And one of the great mentors of mine, along with David Cameron, obviously, is Mitch Resnick from the MIT Media Lab, who's written a book, Lifelong Kindergarten, Cultivating Creativity Through Projects, Passions, Peers and Play. And there's a couple of interesting things in this book. One of the things is around what we call the creative learning spiral, where we're encouraging children to imagine a solution. They're creating it, they're building it, they're playing with it, they're playing with ideas, they're sharing this with other people, they're getting some feedback on that, they're reflecting on the feedback that they've had, they're reimagining it again and building something else, they're playing around with that to sort of try and get it right, they're sharing that with peers or with experts or whatever, they're reflecting on that feedback, and the whole and the whole situation goes round and round and round and round. And again, just the notion here of the creative learning spiral, I think is incredibly important going forward. And then 2 last points, if we just go to the next slide. Another important thing that I think when we talk about project-based learning in schools, and I have to say, I think that Education Scotland needs to have a stronger view on this, we don't at the moment, is what makes good project-based learning and what makes good interdisciplinary learning, is the notion of good learning activities in a project sense, having this idea of what we would call a low floor and a high ceiling. And what this means, dating back from the 1980s, from the work of Seymour Papert and his colleagues, is that we structure the learning activity so that it's accessible to all, but so they can quickly progress at their own level. But the important part of it is this high ceiling means that it's open-ended, and actually the project ends when it loses the meaning to the child around that, like rather than just ending like at the end of the project. And what we mean by wide walls, again added by Mitch Resnick, who I've already quoted in this talk, is the notion of choice within this, and most importantly, child agency, in this work. And I see when I go into a lot of schools, we wrap the whole project-based learning agenda up into, right, you can pick whatever country you want to study, now go away and study it, and these are the criteria that you need to do. Now, for me, that's not rich project-based learning, and it's certainly not playful in nature. It might be interesting, but it's certainly not playful in nature. And if we just go to the next slide, is that I do think that there are some activities or some experiences that are highly playful in nature. And again, these can be used in primary and secondary schools, or indeed in early year settings, around some of the activities, for example, around the making and tinkering space. And by making and tinkering, I don't just mean all the kids making the same thing, but again, providing a series of objects to solve a problem that ideally the children have set themselves, and coming up to the solution, of that problem. And again, I think that block-based programming languages like Scratch, are highly playful in nature when it comes to technology, because of the open-ended nature of it. And again, it allows students to explore, their thoughts by project, peers, passions, and play. And again, and this is not a plug for Lego because other products are available, I also think that systems-based robotics, where children can create whatever they want to create to solve a problem they've defined themselves, is highly playful in nature, rather than all the kids building the same robot. So those are just some interesting thoughts there. And the last point I just want to make, and this is just the last slide, please, and this is a plug actually for some previous work, is that one of the first things that I did just after this time last year is commissioned a piece of work, which is an open access free course run through FutureLearn, which is called Coping with Changes, Social and Emotional Learning Through Play. And we purposely put this course together to help practitioners out there, and it's quite generic in nature, to help practitioners out there, think about different playful learning strategies that they could use with their children to cope with the trauma cope with it by the pandemic. And this course is open now. It's free. We learned from the first version of the course, so it's not longitudinal in nature now. You can now navigate it in any place. And what you'll find is an introduction to learning through play, not dissimilar to the view that I've just put across here. There's a section for early years practitioners, a section for primary practitioners, a section for high school and secondary practitioners, and most importantly, in my mind, a section for professionals to help them look after themselves, but through these kind of playful experiences. So again, would encourage people to make use of this resource, if you think it's appropriate. And then if we just move to the next slide, which is where I'll finish, is that again, what I was sort of really trying to do during that conversation there is to frame a little bit about play in terms of providing a definition, to think a little bit about some of the paradoxes that we've got there, in terms of play, and then to take what I believe are some of the characteristics of play and thinking about how can we integrate that into learning and teaching, and we might even get into the discussions around assessment, during the rest of the conversation. So I'll stop there, but yeah, really looking forward to the next part of the evening.
Yeah, well, I don't know about anybody else, but that was just brilliant. It's a cliche to talk about breath of fresh air, but that's certainly what that was. Some of the things that I wanted to pick up on, Ollie, and I loved about that, and it relates back to Suzanne's comments. The document in play, the key document in play in building in Curriculum for Excellence was building the Curriculum 2. And building the Curriculum 2 was like the other documents. It was big, it was large, and what we wanted to do was try and make these much more accessible. So we summarised these documents. All of the Building the Curriculum series were summarised. They were all down to less than 2,000 words. God alone knows what's happened to them now, because I never see them. And when we did Building the Curriculum 2, we took play and we made it relevant to all ages and stages, which is exactly what you did across that conversation. And we tried to talk within the 2,000 words that we had, or whatever the limit was, around this whole idea of playful pedagogies and so on and so forth. And yet people don't refer to that document. And one of the challenges, I think, for all of us is, how do we get out of this culture of victimhood that we too often have in the profession, where we get too busy drowning to reach for the life belts? There are lots of potential sources of support out there, but if we don't grab them and don't take advantage of them, then we've lost that opportunity. And just your thoughts would be really welcome, Ollie, and any thoughts that you have, Suzanne, on how we get beyond this culture of poor us, we're put upon, we're beleaguered, we're this, we're that, and the next thing, and actually seize the time and make the change. So any thoughts you have on that would be really welcome.
Very happy to go first, and yet. You broke up just a tiny bit for me there, but I think I got the gist of the conversation. So I suppose that's getting my response in case I don't answer it properly. But I think that first of all, the point that you made around the Building the Curriculum series, and I know one thing that you did, David, is that in the first version of Building the Curriculum, it was very, very focused on the early years when we had the word play, and one of the good bits that you did with Kerr Bloom at the time was open that up and make that kind of wider around that. But the challenge that we had is that we never then got into a position where we were able to help people imagine what that looked like in a clearly accessible way. Now, we did, I think, and again, this is just my view, create some examples about what that might have looked like, but for all the right reasons, perhaps, we quality assured it to death. And as a result of that, we became quite risk averse, in our case studies, and our examples there. Rather than, and I think that we've got better at this, at Education Scotland, I have to say, but also in the Scottish system, rather than sort of saying, this seems to work for this school, and this is how we're interpreting this guidance, and it's working for this group of learners at this time, like within this context. And I think we need more of that, but I think we also need better ways to, again, be able to share these examples of what I would call interesting practice in more, interesting and engaging ways. Finding a 12-page PowerPoint PDF and getting people to go through that is not a way to do it. But if you look, for example, how some of the best businesses, create marketing material around that, the initial part of that might be 140 character tweet, and that draws people in. And if you're not interested after that, you go to the next one. But if you are interested, you might be prepared then to go down and watch a 3-minute video. Then after that, you might go back and look for something else. But then if you're interested in the video, you might then be prepared to go and look at that 12-page PDF. So what I'm saying here is we need to be able to, I think, in my view, layer different types of support so people can engage with it, in different ways. But we also, I think, need to be braver about saying this is what seems to work for these young people in this context.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Suzanne, do you want to add to that?
Yes. I suppose I find myself thinking about the term play. And I know I started there, but I find myself really coming back. I'm fascinated by how broadly we apply the word play in our culture. And I'm stressing that because I'm trying to think about this culturally, because I think that's helpful to us. And what you just did, Ollie, was provide lots of examples of what play can look like in an educational context. And with lovely pictures, which brings it alive. And I watched the chat go, explode with, this is wonderful, this is wonderful. Okay. And I think, okay, so teachers need help knowing what play might look like, and then that comforts people. But I'm also tickled that we need to give it titles like social emotional learning and project-based learning, which goes back to my original point that if it's got the word learning in it, everybody goes, phew, that must be okay, then we're learning, we can do that legitimately. And for all that I'm trying to help us to laugh about it, I'm not making fun of it, I'm really intrigued by it. Why do we so need that idea of learning in order to legitimate it? And how does that shape our understanding of play in other contexts? So in the chat, I have popped up a whole range of resources while Ollie was talking, in case that's of interest to anyone. And one of those that I put up was a new event from a therapeutic organization that I follow called Reclaiming Play After the Pandemic. And they will mean play really differently than you've just described to Ollie. And I'm really interested in that. Okay, so the idea that play can be crucial to therapeutically to help us recover from the pandemic, is that the same as thinking about it in education project-based learning? Or is that something different? And how come the word play gets used to apply to both? So whilst you were talking, Ollie, with my lovely bookcase behind me, I'm wandering, pulling books off my shelf, okay? So this is another book about play, which shows the use of play being used to help children recover from World War II, which is not unlike that therapeutic link that I just gave there. Okay, this is a book on lost freedoms that explores how the 1970s was crucial in the environment that children had to play in terms of free play. And this book argues that that the changes in children's capacity to have free play is changing our capacity for democracy. Okay, that becomes really interesting with the rise of fascism in the country at the moment. And this book, which I pulled off my shelf, talks about Scotland after the pandemic. You can see that after the virus. What I wonder is if we really understood the power of play, defined really broadly, that we could see it as part of our recovery from this time. Could we see it as part of fighting fascism? That suddenly sounds so big. And yet, when we understand what play is and how it influences us biologically, that begins to make sense. So how do we help to bring that wide thinking about play to the education system and not just make it about learning? How do we really, how do we think about play broadly? Or actually, does that become so much of a challenge? It's just too hard for us to do it, and we need to somehow break it into sectors. David, that's what I found myself thinking about, is what do we mean by play, and what different kinds of definitions does it have for people in different sectors?
I mean, I think there's, Ollie, you'll have lots of responses to that, but one of the things for me was that I found the whole idea of a broader definition of play incredibly helpful, because the idea of not simply playing but being playful, which in a sense, Ollie, was what you got us into as well. There's the play of ideas. Debate as a form of play. An awful lot of my concept of play centres around your ideas, Suzanne, around the importance of curiosity, exploration. We've got forest play, we play games. There are all sorts of different forms of play. And fundamentally, schools have to be an institution for learning. They will serve other purposes, but the thing that makes schools different from community centres or whatever else is that emphasis on learning. So we do, I think, need to come back to that relationship between play and learning. Otherwise, we don't justify the existence of the school system in any meaningful way at all. Ollie, do you want to add more to that?
I mean, So first of all, Suzanne, I need to get a picture of your bookshelf, because it's there's lots of fascinating copies on that. I mean, it looks far more interesting than David's. He's got a couple of lever arch files on there, and it looks like the IKEA catalogue, or something like that. But no, I can completely take your point and agree with what you're saying, and agree with what you're saying as well there, David. For me, for me, again, to give a Lego Foundation view on this, because this might be interesting, is that they're all about play around that. To put the word learning in there, rightly or wrongly, creates a context where you get buy-in from more people, around that. When we were developing the social emotional learning course for learning through play, we spent a lot of time thinking about the title, but ultimately what we wanted to do was get it out there, and we wanted people to use it. So it was almost about trying to provide, again, rightly or wrongly, a familiar context. I have to say, probably pressurized by the media, that people were looking for, so they would kind of find their support. But for us, it was the finding the support, which was the important part, like rather than the titles around there. So I think we need to be careful not to get too bogged down by the word play and the definitions of play, the definition of play all the time, because actually then what happens is we spend so much time arguing that we never actually get more play into the schools or into the system or into society, and and these sorts of things. And that's why I was really keen to show the spectrum of play slide, because when I was introduced by Dr. Hannah Jensen, it was literally this kind of light bulb moment for me. Partly because of some of the reasons that David was sort of saying there, is that if we're able to think about play, on a spectrum, there are some people that are interested in this part, and that's absolutely fine, because it's perfectly valid. And there are some people that are interested in playing games, playing football, and that's perfectly valid. There's a huge amount of benefits to playing sport and making that work. And there are some people that are interested in more sort of structured games, and there are some people that are interested in this, if you like, this guided play, as well. And that's where perhaps the project-based learning and the inquiry-based learning would come in. And I think it's kind of all valid to make it work. But yeah, I think definition, and that's not to say I don't think definitions are important. I just think that sometimes we spend so much time and energy trying to win the academic argument, we never actually get onto the important stuff, which is supporting kids.
If I can come back there, Ollie, I agree with you. For all that I have been trying to tease us a little bit about the need for the word learning, it's not a problem at one level. If we need the word learning in order to legitimate it, then we need it. What I'm interested in is that we do need that. So that tells us something about our culture and about how you get play into education. So if you need the word learning in order to get play into education, yay, let's use that. And at the same time, given that we're all here for this conversation, let's get curious about that. And let's not think, okay, so play doesn't then, and when you get to the end of learning, you know, so if play has therapeutic value as well, how do you help people to, I mean, are we talking about a different process then? How come play got to be the word that, how did play end up framing all of that? That is a really interesting question for all of us to ask. And then how do you help more people to think about that? Let me give one more example. If you have children building a great big Lego project on the floor in front of the television, when it comes time for dinner, many families will go, you'll need to clean up that Lego now because it's a mess. If you interrupt the construction of that Lego project, you've just undermined the child's capacity for really rich thinking. And many parents won't think about that because they just see it as just play and we can clean up that activity now. And that must have gotten even worse in crowded households over the pandemic. So I'm just thinking about the breadth of things that represented in that word play and how you help lots of sectors, including parents, to think about just how important playfulness, activity, adventure is for children, which David makes this conversation really wide, but I presume that's what you want in a creative conversation.
I'll just maybe sort of quickly just come back on that, and again, and it's an observation more than anything else, because I think the whole Lego model bit is interesting, and I can probably say this now around that. It is that, again, if we go back to that kind of spectrum of play around that, there's if a child gets a Lego set, you know, for example, often they'll follow the instructions to build that Lego set. So that's one form of play around that. But that's quite a different experience, I think, to having that Lego set without the instructions and trying to build it just by looking at the picture on the box. And a very, very different experience again, you know, from just getting the bits and building whatever you want around that. So again, I think even when we think about that in terms of the spectrum, there are different experiences and different sort of structures there.
And if your structure, unfinished as it is regarded as important enough in your family to leave it up rather than put it all back in the box because you didn't manage to finish it in the time you had, and it leads to richer and deeper extended thinking, that adds even to what you're saying there, Ollie.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And lots of interesting stuff coming through in the chat, and some really interesting references coming through in the chat. So a real open invitation to anyone. If you want to put your hand up and make a contribution to the discussion, we would entirely welcome that. An awful lot of emphasis, I think, coming through in the conversation about the need, in a sense, to compensate for the loss of free play that there's been in children's wider lives. You know, you mentioned a number of books, Suzanne. One of the ones that you didn't mention was Toxic Childhood, Sue Palmer's book, which takes us right into that kind of territory. So a sense of now of schools being a safe place for children where they can play, and sometimes they don't have that opportunity elsewhere. So there's a lot coming through around that, a lot coming through from people saying, you know, do we really need to worry so much about the language? A lot of the kind of theme, in a sense, Ollie, that you're picking up. But if there's anything else that people want to come in on, please raise your hand. If I may, just a couple of things that are coming through both on the chat and have come up in the conversation. The whole bit about parents and what parents' expectations are. I did a thing at the book festival years ago called "In Education, Why Don't We Want What Our Children Need?" And you know, why have we not been successful with that kind of wider conversation, which is reflected in Parliament? One of the reasons, Suzanne, I think, why people are afraid is that if the Scottish Nationalist Party as a government don't manage to deliver on PISA scores and status, they will be crucified by the opposition parties, and they will be at risk of opening up a flank on which they will readily be attacked, and they will get a public response to that, because the biggest coverage that education gets in newspapers and elsewhere is when they construct the league tables to compare school performance. So, you know, some interesting stuff in there about why are we not having more of these conversations with the wider public? And if we are having them, what is it that we need to do to make them more successful in taking the conversation forward?
David, one of the reasons I'm really positive is that I think we have a big starting point in Scotland because of the ACEs movement, right? We're doing a better job of that nationally than, say, England. And I'm just, you know, England isn't that far away. And yet we are having a really different, much more vibrant and rich conversation about childhood trauma than a place not very far away. And although we're using the word trauma, what ACEs is really about is child development, right? It's really about how children develop, and what happens in terms of ACEs, you're really stressed with sweaty hair. Okay, play is the same thing. What kinds of experiences, to use your word a minute ago, Ollie, what kind of experience do you have in your childhood? And how does that influence the development of your biology? So I think that we have a wider understanding now of human development, even if everybody isn't quite using that language. I think there's an intuitive understanding of that. And so many people now use that lens to think about a range of things, like classroom experiences, like recovering from the pandemic. To have recovering from the pandemic seen through a trauma lens is really valuable. So and in Scotland, we also think about relationships as crucial to that ACEs movement. So it's not just about the trauma, it's about the relationships that help you recover from it and in which trauma happens. So I think that's a real place of strength from which we have to operate in Scotland. And maybe we can use that more actively in ways to think about play, about recovery, to join together some different kinds of discourses. I don't know what you think about that.
So I completely agree with you on that. My worry or an anxiety that I have at the moment is that we, as a result of the pandemic, we've forgotten about, or all of the great work that was done at ACEs, has got a load of pandemic paperwork on top of it, you know, and people are prioritizing that, where we're not actually thinking about that this is part of the, you know, part of the solution moving forward, as you say, from an incredibly strong base, and also, you know, from something which possibly, I would say, in the last decade was a movement that united, you know, more educators, more parents, a range of public health professionals together, you know, to work for the best interests of children. So I think we definitely need to go back and we need to revisit that. The other, I think, worry I have, and again, you hinted on this by mentioning some of the work going on in England, is at the moment we're in an interesting paradox around the word catch up, you know, to use a media phrase. Because of course, when we think about catch up at the moment, that is often associated with the catching up of knowledge, you know, and some kind of knowledge deficit around that. Whereas we need to, if we can't remove the word catch up and make it about recovery or make it about something else, we need to change the narrative around catch up and be clear that when we're talking about catch up, it's about catching up with friends, catching up with yourself, where you are as a human being, catching up with the outdoors and catching up with environments, and catching up, I think, with some of those rich experiences that many schools offer, which actually are very, very tricky to do when you're sat in front of a computer screen and learning from home. And some of these things are around exploring emotions and feelings and other, other things to do with well-being, as you say, linked to the trauma lens.
I'm going to bring in Sue Carter now, who's had her hand up. Sue, do you want to come in and make your point or raise your question or whatever?
Yeah, thank you very much, David. I just really want to think about how and why play dissolves in the classroom setting. And I'm thinking really, my background is as a practicing artist, but I work in school as well. And having that discipline as an artist, and I think artists generally just play. They play pretty much all the time. My dad was an artist and he played right up until the end of his life, really. So I was very lucky to get that education. But I'm just thinking about how play dissolves, and I'm thinking about the landscape of the classroom. When you go into a classroom, you will find tables, you will find chairs, you will find jotters, you will find textbooks, you will find all of this stuff. It makes me laugh that when I do playful learning of angles, I have children measure angles of table corners and we collect the 90-degree angles around the classroom. Not in my class. When I worked in Stirling, I didn't have any tables, I didn't have any chairs, I didn't have any jotters, and I didn't have any textbooks. We had imaginative play in the primary 7 classroom. And what was wonderful about that was the developed ability of the children was so, it was so heightened, it was wonderful. So I think our classrooms and how we laden them, we fill them so much with stuff that actually 90% of it never gets used. It's just stuff. And as Ollie's slide said, was, play is the child, not the toy. So give me an empty room and we will play. And that's really what I wanted to bring to the conversation.
And that's what Peter Brook said about theatre, wasn't it? That you don't need the proscenium arch and you don't need the stage. All you need is the audience and you can have theatre. And I think your point is all we need is the children and we can learn it. And I think that's a really, really important point to be making. Ollie, Suzanne, do you want to come back in on that?
Yes, David, I find myself wanting you to tell your story about pushing all the tables back when you were trying to teach history. And the point, will you tell that story for folks? And the point of that story is that it felt like you were taking a risk to do what our contributor just said. It's a great example of what it looks like in the classroom. Will you tell people that story?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was a history teacher to trade, and obviously I was a secondary teacher to trade. And when we taught the Battle of Bannockburn, we reenacted it, basically. And what we did was we cleared the classroom, we set up a huge battle board, and we had troops and my head of department, because he was the head of department and we were very hierarchical, he insisted that he would be Robert the Bruce and equally insisted that I would be Edward II. And in the unenlightened times in which we were operating, I had to fully play up the fact that Edward II was gay, much in the style of Larry Grayson at that era. And kids charged round the room, making all the movements of the troops and all of that. And, when you went back, as you're suggesting, and as Sue was pointing out, these were the things that kids remembered. These were the things that they remembered and took away with them. Yeah, I mean, the point you're also making, which I think is an important one, was that was a sense of risk of doing something that was perceived by the young folk in the class, by ourselves, as outrageous. And we did also go outdoors, Sue. We did also go outdoors, and we did fight the Battle of Bannockburn. But when the casualty rate got to a certain level, we felt we had to take it back a bit.
Okay, and so Anne, so your story from however many years ago that is, when there was not such a discourse of play in education is still being replicated in the chat right now. So Rebecca has said, I have a P5-6 class and I started really using play this year and people still gasp and tell me I'm brave. I've never had a class full of such happy and content individuals whilst at school. So my point is, why does this still feel radical? I'm really intrigued by that. So on the one hand, it can feel like we're making progress. And on the other hand, if we were really making progress, and your story would be history, David, and Rebecca wouldn't have been able to say she was being brave in the chat. So there is something interesting about how anxious doing what is good for children actually still can make us, which is why we need your leadership, Ollie. And we need to appreciate that for all that we say, play all the time, it's still an anxious place for lots of people.
All right, and I'm gonna take that on and not shut down that particular conversation, but add another element to it if that's okay. Because one of the things that everybody needs to think about now is the position that we've adopted in Scotland around the United Nations Charter for the Rights of the Child. And just interesting to think about how that plays in to that whole idea of play and child-centeredness and how we should respond to children. Ollie, do you want to say a bit about UNCRC and how that factors into this discussion?
I just think again, let me just make another comment first, because I did kind of want to say, based on Sue's story about her classroom, that I'm guessing that the reason that there were no tables and rulers and jotters were because of sound pedagogical reasons, not because of budget cuts within Stirling Council. So that's the first thing that I wanted to kind of mention, around that. But my point with it was really is we need to get better at creating these enabling environments, which is an easy thing to say, but actually a really, really tricky thing to do around that. And I think, and this is actually linked into the UN Convention of Children's Rights as well, around that, which is where I'm going with it, is that, we say a lot, in schools, we want to encourage teachers to take more, teachers need to take more risks, but we don't actually often model what that might look like. Yet, if we think about how we encourage children to take risks, we're actually pretty good at that. like around that, like we're actually pretty good at making that work. So how do we create the educator's version of that in a way to allow people to do it? And part of that for different groups of people comes down to permissions, I think, and that's part of the mix in there. So the reason that you got away with your battle story, David, was because you had the head of department on board for whatever reason. Now, he might have been bullying you hideously during that period, but he was on board with the experience around that. And presumably you were either out in a hut like I was back in East Lothian, and the head teacher didn't know about it, or the head teacher was involved in that as well. That enabling environment was there. So sometimes that, I think, enabling environment can come locally, or sometimes it's helpful to have enabling environments perhaps linked into policy, and I think UN Convention of Human Rights child's rights is a good example of that. Bringing if you like international policy like into Scots law, because of course with that, which is what's hugely exciting about it, comes a child's right to play. I'm paraphrasing there, and within the UN Convention of Children's Rights, which is a slightly different definition, I think, to Scott's story, is a child in the UN is a child between 0 and 18, rather than 0 and 16. So again, it gives this permission, for this all through kind of play experience to make that happening. So at some point, the permissions are there, like at a national level, and then we need to sort of tackle those enabling environments, at that leadership level, like within the schools. And if I think back to the hundreds of courses that I've been in, or conferences that I've attended, or going through SQH and doing all these things, I could tell you a lot about the theory of leadership, but actually, how to create enabling environments, without saying you need to distribute leadership, you need to delegate, which is quite often what it gets watered down to, is actually a tricky thing, and maybe something that we need to do on. Now, I know that my colleagues, who I think do a fantastic job, in the professional learning and leadership team, these are some of the issues that they're looking at when the system changed and all these things. But again, we need to get better at that, and we need to make sure that it's not just practitioners that are taking part in these courses that can benefit from that learning. It's all practitioners in Scotland that do that.
Sorry, Suzanne, just before you come in, if I may, one of the interesting things that I did with Tim Brighouse was we did a conversation around mistakes. And we did a conversation with head teachers where we talked about mistakes we'd made and then talked about what we'd learned from them. And the response that we got from that was that people found that incredibly empowering. That, in Tim's case, somebody who was clearly successful, and in my case, somebody who got away with it a lot of the time. But we, the fact that we had managed to make real careers despite making some big errors, and that idea of being willing to face up to that, I think, is so important. Suzanne.
That's actually what I was going to ask Ollie. So when you put that that coal effect fire in the front of the hut, which David so remembers, did it feel like it took courage for you to do that? Or did it just feel obvious? Because I think there's something about knowing about the experience of doing these, what some people regard as edgy things. So, Rebecca has been told she's brave. Rebecca might not feel brave herself. It might just feel obvious to her. I wondered, did it feel obvious to you, or did it feel like you were having to be brave in a system that might take you to task?
So it's a great question. I think it made me feel strong because it was really, really heavy, and I was living in Edinburgh at the time, and I had to get it on top of my car and drive 30 miles to the school and get some 6-year pupils to take it off. But no, joking aside, I think it was, there was a bit of risk, I suppose, associated with that, but it hadn't been the first risk that I'd taken in that school in terms of building up to what this might look like, but also at the same time, like, I wasn't putting this on for the head of education that was coming on was coming on a visit. We didn't have tea or cakes or any of those things. I was doing it because I was wanting to create an interesting and engaging environment for the kids, to sort of make that work. But you have, Suzanne, made me think of something, is that in some of the work that we did at the International School of Billund, which is a good reference point for me because there was a lot of work that was done there. One of the things that was concluded by the Project Zero team was around, if you really want to create a playful school, you have to have a playful staff. So you have to inject some of this notions of playfulness, whatever your definition is to that, into the life and the blood of the school. And one of the things that we did there is we took the notion of collaborative inquiry, so teachers working on their own action research projects and working in learning groups and those sorts of things to actually benefit in the classroom, and created a different version of that, which was called Playful Participatory Research, which is a big long-winded term around that. But it was set up, or the framework was set up, and it's subsequently been published and peer reviewed, and they've presented it at various conferences. Is the notion of, if you're trying to develop practice around play in the classroom, then actually a way to develop that practice to do it in a playful way, because then of course you are starting to get into the mind of the child and the mindset of the child as well. And I think we can take that premise, and we could, for example, replace the word play for creativity and think, well, if we want to get more creativity into children, we need to get a creative staff. We need to develop the skills in staff to be able to do that as well. Which again is a very obvious thing to say and a tricky thing to do.
Well, I get a sense that one of the things the ACES movement has done is to give people a broader context in which to be brave. Because several people in the chat are saying that they felt really supported by their head teacher to do brave things and to take risks. What happens if you're in a school where the leadership isn't supporting playful approaches? How do people step into and have these conversations? Where do you draw strength from? And I think that the ACEs movement is giving people a strength from which to start, so we can have different kinds of conversations about what is good for children's development.
Mm-hmm.
And it just becomes interesting to think about what is the experience of trying to shift a culture, shift a discourse, and where has it been successful and where is there still challenge? And why is the word brave still turning up in this chat? That tells us something. It's a mirror.
Mm-hmm.
It helps us to see where we are at. And if we don't get this, then our children's recovery from the pandemic is going to be impeded. So can we speed up the understanding of this, or is it going to be impeded? Some of that leadership will come from the people who are attending here tonight. So go be brave, I guess, is my message.
But I think for me, and I'm conscious of time, and I'm also keeping an eye on the numbers of people in the conversation and leading the conversation. I think for anyone who's been part of this conversation, that process has been accelerated tonight. The fact that we're having this conversation in public, the fact that you've been here, Ollie, using words like joy, like delight, like play, you know, so many of the words you use, so positive, and critically as well in the conversation. So many of the comments from both of you have been about children. I've just been so absolutely delighted and so struck by the slides that you used, by the number of references, Ollie, that you made to children, by the centrality that you placed on the learner. And what we can do, I think, in any area is we can move in leaps or we can move in steps. But if we can't make the leaps, we shouldn't refuse to take the steps. And I think, you know, one of the things that's run through my head, and I'm sorry that we haven't had time to talk about it, but one of your other experiences, Ollie, was as head teacher at Kingussie High School. And when you were there, along with your colleagues and the other staff, you timetabled that school to seem timeless. So the school was timetabled really cleverly, exceptionally cleverly in my view, but it was timetabled to allow 80 options for youngsters in the senior school. It was timetabled not for 1 year, but across the whole 3 years of the senior phase. And that for me is also about play. That willingness to play with ideas, to play with possibilities, to play with technologies, to play with structures, and to use that to make the structures invisible. And I think that there's something really important about that. There have also been some brilliant contributions coming in. Louise Hu, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Louise, some great contributions there, and we'd be really interested in hearing more from you about what you do and how it is that you do it. Some other wonderful contributions coming in the chat, so really, really grateful for that. But really grateful to the two of you for stimulating the discussion, for giving it scope, for giving it breadth, and giving it a sense of life. This is one of the liveliest conversations I've been involved in around education over the years. So thank you very much for that. And if all we've done today is open up the idea that education doesn't have to be all about delivery, which is the message coming through from England and the Department for Education there, that it's all about delivery, it's all about imparting, it's all about giving things to people. And if we've taken that to the idea that learning can also be about capture, about opening up that opportunity for young people to explore, to see what they do with that, and then to build next steps on that. Because we do have to recognise the duality of our role. And it's been such a wonderful combination today. So thanks to both of you, and thanks to everyone for attending, and thanks for the contribution in the chat. Have a great evening, everyone, and bye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
It was great. Thank you.